Now let's see how to use breakdowns over a full range of keys. The character starts facing left, he hears some good news, anticipates, jumps, turns, lands and squashes, overshoots and settles. None of these 8 drawings is a breakdown. They're all keyframes. You might, at a push, consider the push and contacts to be breakdowns or breakdowny, but there's so much going on, I really wanted to think of these as keys. So here's the scene fully animated with in-betweens just going straight between each of these 8 keyframes. And I think it looks pretty nice. It's a pretty decent squishy animation. But let's see if we can go a little bit further. And before we do that, I will give you one last reminder. Always plot your arcs. These little dotted lines here are giving you a rough idea of the arc paths of the different body parts, different colors for different parts. So I will plot one with a blue line for one side of the body and one green for the other. Very important, never to forget that. Okay, so everything that you've seen so far was controlled by these 8 poses. So what if we want to go further? Well, a powerful way to do this is to add key actions on the breakdowns, frames that might in many cases be just a boring old in-between. So let's do something interesting on these breakdowns more than that simple tween. So here I've sketched in the parts of the breakdowns that will be basic tweens in dark and the parts that will be the key components in their own right in red. So notice on frame 9, and I've marked the breakdown by this underline. That's what signifies this drawing in classical animation notation as a breakdown. So on that frame, I've put an opposing action on the arm as the body moves down. As the body moves down, the arms move up to counteract. They oppose the body. On frame 19, that's here, I've added a leading action on the left elbow. So it's a more drastic compression of the elbow to lead that action. On frame 23, I've pushed both arms forward further than they really probably should be as a strict in-between. I've also straightened out the arm here. A strict in-between would still be bent, but this is a much stronger shape and it gets us into this pose here so that it reads much quicker and much snappier. On frame 31, the arms overshoot and oppose again. So that as the body falls, they move up, they hit their high point. So the high point of the arm doesn't happen on the high point of the body. It happens, in this case, 4 frames later. That's really going to strengthen the height point of the jump. On frame 34, I experimented. I made this really snappy downward movement. And I wasn't sure if this would read because it's only going to be down there for 1 frame, but it's the kind of position that you might feel rather than actually see. I could have done like a smooth in between this pose here and this one, but that might feel a little soft. So I think this is going to feel like a much harder impact. On frame 37, you'll see I've drawn nothing. That's because I want these to be a smooth path. You don't have to put fancy breakdowns in. Sometimes you can just keep these straight. So that'll be a big drawing, but it's not going to do anything magical. I could bring the arms down again, but the problem with that is that they're going from here to a down, to an up, to a down, to an up. So I think the safest thing, hammer into that, and then smooth into this. On frame 45, the arms will overshoot. Notice how they're at their highest point here. The body overshoots on 41, the arms overshoot on 45, and then everything settles into 51. So right now, I'm just going to apply these breakdowns to the right arm. And I'm overlaying these alterations on top of the original. So you can see the original before, in that little grayed out path, so you can compare the difference between one and the other. And here I flashed it in red, just in case you're really having problems seeing exactly where the alterations were. Those little red flashes, those are the breakdowns. I'm going to play this at half speed. So you can see the difference already between the original, everything happening on one keyframe, and now you can see that the arm has its own importance and its own path of action. Here's the action without the highlights, and notice that the arms now have their own extremes. So that right arm, it just feels like it's not locked in with the rest of the motion. It's much more natural and much more cartoony. So very quickly, we'll do the same thing for the other arm. And the entire range of the right arm now in red, not just the breakdowns, but easier to see like this, I think. And now the finished scene. So I've taken out all those little flashes and overlays. So now we have the body with its original 8 key poses and the arms with their own separate breakdowns. So to keep things simple, I placed the breakdowns for both left and right arms on frames 9 and 19, 23 and 31. But when animators get really fancy, when they really want to show off, they could put these on separate keys. So they might put the breakdown high point arm on frame 8 and then on frame 10 for the left arm. So you don't have to put both on the same frame. So it depends how far you want to take this. You can even do the same thing with the legs. In this case, I kept the legs simple, but there was nothing stopping me from putting breakdowns on the legs. So for example, the highest leg might have been on frame 25, maybe up here. I might have stretched this one further. So there's any number of things that you can do to a character with the breakdowns to just make this really, really elaborate. My advice, if you haven't done this before, start simple and then build up more complexity as you become more comfortable. Because, of course, this does, if you're working digitally, you're adding more little keyframe slugs all the way along your timeline. There'll be a keyframe for a left arm here, a keyframe for a right arm there, a keyframe for a foot there. So it can be a little bit intimidating, but what will happen as you do this more, you'll get more used to it. So for final comparison, the before and after. I didn't apply the breakdowns to the feet again, so I could have done that and this would have looked very, very different, but I think this is a really nice side-by-side. If you look carefully, and I'm going to play these at half speed as I talk over this, so you might be able to see the differences a little more easily. So the breakdown is more than just the largest gap between two keys. Correct use of the breakdown is going to allow you to add this extra layer of quality and depth to your work. So know the difference between a key and a breakdown. And the animators who churn out the great quality animation at great quantity are the ones who really know how to offload key actions onto their breakdowns. And they also gain a much higher level of control over the scene because although you don't want to have too few keys, you don't want to have too many either. And these are both beginner mistakes. So getting the balance right, critical. Once you do that, I think you'll be well on your way. One subject that tends to get left out of the popular how-to animation books is thumbnails. So considering the importance of thumbnails, it's very strange. So let's correct that by taking a close look at them and why you need them. So here's what it looks like very quickly animated. It's first pass at a loose, dizzy walk. And it's already off to a good start. So once more, these are the thumbnails. I created them in a lined notebook, which is why you can see these horizontal lines. That should give you a feel for how tiny these are. Now the figures are little more than an inch tall. They're drawn lightly with a 0.3 millimeter mechanical pencil. I really like those because I can get a really precise fine line at a very small size, but use whatever you prefer. Regular pencil, 0.5 mil, whatever works for you. I draw many of my thumbnails in a coffee shop, and it's nice to get out of the studio or away from the computer, get some fresh air, nice cup of coffee, plan out the scene in a stress-free environment. So let's take a look at some more of these drawings. So what I will do, I'll take this home, scan it into my computer, go take it into Photoshop, clean them up like reasonably. It doesn't have to be fantastic. Kind of, you see crud around there. That doesn't matter. Just chop up the frames onto their own little image, like so. So I bring them into whatever animation program I'm using, whether it's Harmony or Flash or some other software, place them on the timeline, time them out as my timing charts in the thumbnail suggest. And then when I'm doing my final animation, on top of that, whether it's a puppet or if I'm drawing it, I use them as a visual reference or a pose guide for the final animation. So if you're using a CGI program like Maya or Cinema 4D, you can import these flat images as references for your models. This isn't something that you only do if you're a hand animator. So one more time, that's the first pass. And I stress I didn't make any major adjustments to those thumbnails in these poses. And now that's not always the case. Often you'll have to tweak things even with your first animation pass. But this does illustrate how powerful this method is when you get used to it. So it's a huge time saver. So don't think you're going to slow down because you're adding this step of making thumbnails. The step of thumbnails will speed you up. You can even use thumbnails for a very simple action like a cycle of a bird flying. The circled numbers represent keyframes, so it's keyframe number 1, keyframe number 3. The lines between are the timing charts, so this is the tick that represents 1, the tick that represents 3, and this tick represents the in-between or the breakdown. So I can change the position of the timing. This could be 5, this would then be 4, and I could slow out at this frame, 3, 2, 1, and so forth. Now, thumbnails are really useful in maintaining an overview of a very tricky action, something that you can get lost in, like the drag of the cloth tied to this bouncing ball. Now, notice also the key numbers and the timing charts. So in this example, I've animated the keys on odd-numbered frames so that the in-betweens will be placed on the even-numbered frames. And this is a trick that we used to do in the traditional animation era. We would draw on the odd numbers and then we would leave the even numbers and only in between them if the action was very fast. So sometimes it's a nice thing to go back to because it means your animation will be smooth if you have, a key on 1, 3, 5, 7. And if some of these gaps are huge, like here, you can, between 13 and 15, you can always put in a 14. And as we would say, go on to ones. So 1 frame every second rather than 2. So this may be irrelevant to you if you're working in CGI, of course. Here's that final ball scene animated, and I think it looks really nice. That was straight from the thumbnails to this. Thumbnails are also great for planning out full dialogue and acting scenes. You can write the relevant phonemes and words over each drawing. So here it's, huh? It's you too? And you can see I've slightly cropped it here, but these little diagonal lines here are plotting in the accents of the dialogue. Huh? And so, for example, if it's you too, then this line here is going up. So I can plot my accents and what frame numbers they happen on. Any number of alterations can be made and seen to the entire acting of the scene in one image. This is a series of thumbs I made in an old Flash program, and you can see how big and ugly the brush strokes are. But even something as rough as this is really useful in plotting out the keys. And I want to stress, this also shows your drawings don't have to be nice. They can be quite crude as long as they're functional. And you'll also find that by having to estimate the key timing and in-between spacing in this form by plotting these numbers, I think that would take about half a second and so on, and slow out of this, slow into that. You'll find that by doing that, your sense of timing will improve because you'll be estimating before animating. You'll be able to see how your estimation corresponds to the first pass of your animation. Notice the arcs marked in grey. It's a great way to think out many of the technical issues before you even start the scene. It's a huge time saver. In a previous movie, I showed you how to create thumbnails. Because they're so important, I want to talk some more about them and to show some examples of how to apply them to mechanical scenes like walks. So because my thumbs tend to be very clean, I don't want you to be intimidated and to get the impression that yours have to match that level. So you can use very rough thumbs, very sketchy ones. And these were done really quickly for a puppet scene in Flash. And they only took a few minutes to rough in, and they worked fine. This is a page of walk cycles that I sketched in a notebook for another course on the principles of animation. And I spent more time on these. They're definitely cleaner than that first sample. They were fairly close to the final animation, so the time was well worth it. They're pretty nice poses. Now, because it can be tricky for the eye to follow which arm and leg is moving where, especially on the passing position, which is this mid one here where everything is coming together, I often like to colour them in green and blue or different colours for the left side and the right side, or to fade or darken out the far side. So my approach for creating these was to draw the contacts first. This one, the contact here, then the passing position, the midpoint, and then the down position or recoil on the high position. So in a later course from that one, I actually got to reuse these and actually show how to animate them. So it was a course on attitude walk cycles. So here's the strut, the stomp, and just a goofy walk, something that's a little cartoony and silly because it's got these weird poses in it. In motion, it looks fine. Now, here's an example of a thumbnail that didn't quite work. There's one trouble spot here. Now, when you scan through it, it looks pretty nice. Like this looks great, and all this worked fine. And then here was the trouble spot. And so what happened was when I assembled this and tried to play these frames in sequence, it looks at this point here, I wanted it to feel like a big loose swing, but it looked like a punch. He seemed to be punching the camera in the face, which didn't work. So I'm including this as an example of an effect that looked great in thumbnail form, but that once it was actually played, it looked awful. Now, this entire thing could, I'm sure, be salvaged, but it definitely means changing this pose. So I'm including this just to show you, sometimes the thumbnails will fail at some point. It doesn't mean you don't thumbnail. It means you go back and you correct the thumbnail or correct the animation to work around that problem. So let's say that you've thumbnailed and blocked in a really nice walking action. And in this case, the character walks from left to right to pick something off a table. The three rightmost images are already really close together. So what if you want to, focus on this and maybe you want to add some more thumbnails? Because this is kind of tricky. He's still walking and we want to see how he stops exactly. Does he scrunch down? Is there some business in here? How do you do that? Because any more drawings in here and it'll be like a pasta noodle soup. So solution would be to either erase those drawings and redraw them further apart on that sheet, or to have a second sheet and just pull them all apart. So in this case, I had the files in Photoshop, so I just pull the images further apart to make room just to add a couple of more poses. So here would be the clean sheet with these poses pulled apart. And then you can add this area that you want to focus on. So you don't have to have one. If you have like a 10-second scene or a 20-second scene, there's no way you can have that entire thing on one sheet of paper. So you can have rows. You can have like one row going to here, another row to here, and so on, as many as you need. And as you can see here, the real point of interest that I wanted to really work on was the landing, how he goes from the walk to the landing, stops walking, and how does the arm move. And notice here I break the elbow. That was a nice little touch from this point here. The elbow breaks, and then it'll break again into this pose here. And you can add colors to all of these. Looks beautiful. Again, my drawing's very clean. I know that. You don't have to draw to this level of cleanness if you don't want to. If you do want to, go right ahead. So far, we've been looking at fairly straightforward mechanics, getting this guy to walk, move, left to right. But what if you want to do something a little more theatrical? So here's a pose test of an emotional breakdown. The stock market's crashed, he's lost his life savings. But I want him walking across the screen. He starts in frame 1, and then he starts walking across the screen. And again, track your eye, and you'll find it's easy to read the action. You can just go again, from here, all the way through. Okay, I'll take my mouse away so you do it at your own speed. And I'm just scanning my eye over this, just giving it just maybe a fraction of a second on each drawing. And I can read it like just a series of frames. And I think that's going to look really good. So let's see what this looks like in animation form. I think that's pretty cute. Timing feels okay, so my guess on the timing, and of course the walk in there too, also helps to nail the timing because you know you're going to have to hit these poses at half-second beats. The thumbnail has the entire action blocked in, from poses to timing to spacing, as well as some of the arcs. And in one glance, you can survey through the thumbnails the entire action. So I can compare all the keys in one glance to see if any of them are too similar or sticky or if they're in the right emotional tone. For me, making scenes like this without thumbnails is a false economy. I think more often than not, it'll take you longer and the animation won't be as good. So why not do thumbnails? In previous movies, I've dealt with thumbnails, a basic introduction and the more intermediate one, and how you would plan walks and mechanical actions with them. But now let's focus on thumbnails for acting and dialogue scenes. These thumbnails are for a scene to be animated in Flash, believe it or not. But I really wanted to push Flash as far as I could to break it out of the boring symbol puppet business. So thumbnails are the way to do that. Here's how the scene turned out finally. Pretty snappy, some nice action there. So let's see how I approach the thumbnails. First, I drew the start pose on the left, then the stop pose on the right. I knew there's going to be about 6 or 7 poses between them. And at this point, I didn't worry about the timing, just the poses. So once the start and the stop poses were in place, I drew the anticipation and the overshoot. So anticipation here, overshoot there. Now, I could have kept this anticipation pose as the anticipation pose. But I thought that an anticipation to the anticipation would be really good. Now, that might sound silly. How many anticipations do you need? But sometimes it really helps to punctuate one with another. So as though the character has seen something so unbelievable or infuriating that they immediately shoot up before they shoot down again into the physical anticipation of the big turn. Next is the breakdown. And here I could have gone with a simple in-between. There was just a perfect halfway position between 15 and 24. But look at the arms on 7 and 15. I got bored with looking at it and I thought, let's do something to smash the elbow, to break that joint. So the joint goes from this V to this inverted V and then back to the other V again. So it's breaking the joint, gives a really nice, strong transition from one into the other. And we have the frames to get away with it. And now another breakdown on 26. Pretty much straightforward. I just push the elbow forward a little bit and I pull the arm up a little more than it maybe normally might have been, like the bend on that wrist, for example. And now the final breakdown, which is pretty straightforward, with the exception of the bottom end of the shirt there, which is shooting up. See, that's the height there, but the breakdown is a little higher. So that's an extreme action happening on what's otherwise a breakdown, an in-between. And just to really telegraph those breakdowns, there they are in red. The parts in black are just silly old in-betweens you could give to an assistant, but the bits in red, that's the animator's business. So that's how you really add the extra layer of oomph. And there's the final result one more time. So the thumbnails took me about 2 hours for that level of detail. And in case you're thinking that's a lot of time, yeah, they were very detailed, but in most productions I could work a little looser than that and not take so long. But those 2 hours essentially animated 85% of the scene for me. So why not spend the time doing them? So after that detailed view of a thumbnail, let's see another example that's kind of similar. Here we have a pose test of an Igor type character helping Professor Frankenstein to create the monster. So the thumbnails for this is the first pass, but just the keys. So now you can see how it's possible to construct this action with as few poses as you really need. And in this case, 5. 5 was enough. And my rough timing estimates are in here on the circled numbers. 2 hours to thumbnail. This isn't the final one, so let me show you the final one with the breakdowns. And of course, again, on the breakdowns, we juiced this thing up a little bit. I just scrunched, instead of like a straight up to that, I brought them down and up to that on the body, even though the arms are moving pretty much straight between, but the body's going down and up like a little hunch. Straight on number 19 again, we're an otherwise simple in between from here into here, but I got this nice little leading action on the foot, breaking it into here. Number 23, another breakdown, but I just have a, tricky little hand move there. Other than that, they're fairly straightforward. Final scene. Igor, flip the switch. And then Igor replies,
"Yes, master."
Get the idea. So it looks pretty good. Here's a quick and dirty thumbnail to show that you can also thumbnail scenes in depth and space. You're not limited to one plane. So let's see what it looks like as a pose test, just when we bring these frames into our animation program and we slug them out. So the animation will look like that. As you can see, I'm feeling it. That's a nice little vibe. There's no in-betweens on it. That's just the basic poses, and hence, pose test. So then you'd start fleshing it in with the final animation poses and then all the in-betweens. So what I want to tell you about this method of working is it's amazing what you can do with it. I was accepted into the animation department at Don Bluth's animation studio mostly due to a scene that was animated in about as much detail as this. It was, it had almost no internal detail. It was just a pure sketch. So the great thing about this is that you can use something as simple as this to communicate the emotion, the content, and the action of your scene. And if you can do it with this, then the rest is just practice, getting your drawing down, getting the fine-tuning. So this is it's a fundamental way of really honing your talent and your scenes. So when I advise people, some things I advise lightly and some heavily. This is a heavy piece of advice. It's do it, otherwise I think you'll pay the price. So, and if you do it, you'll achieve the rewards. Drawing believable costumes or fabric can look like a puzzle. The finished drawing can seem to be a maze of lines, but beneath this surface complexity, there's often a very straightforward process. So here it is. We'll start with a curved line, and I'm going to draw it here in red, just to give you an example. Now, from this line, you can extend or extrude vertical lines or diagonal lines. Note that they don't all have to be parallel, and some are at angles. This is going to be a varied shape. And then we close off our shape to create this long, wavy ribbon. So this is a great way to design flags, big, long pieces of drapery, and so on. So we use the same process of building complex costumes, dresses, coats, this kind of thing, from these simple geometric forms. In the figure on the left, the ballerina dress is constructed from a figure 8 or an O-shaped loop. And you can see that very lightly sketched in red. Follow that contour there. In the middle, you can see the addition of waves along the outer hem of the dress. And on the right side, we add these internal lines to finish off the form and give it solidity. So on the middle, you see how I've done a wave form that follows as a center, the red line. And then again, you add all the internal constructions, these lines here. And presto, you have this apparently very complex form. So let's take a more realistic dress. And here we start out with an extremely simple hanging piece of fabric. It's like a towel hanging up in your bathroom. So the second step would be to add a waveform to that curve. And then you can begin to sketch in the reverse side. You can see these little dark lines here. And then you add the external folds, and they give the material solidity. And now you have something that's really beginning to look like clothing. And so here's a finished rough sketch. And this shows you how the dress hangs on the body. And notice how the lines on the left side of the hip move towards an invisible point of origin on the hip. And that would be up here. These lines here, they all seem to converge at this point, roughly in here. So these points are called points of origin. And when you crease clothing, it tends to have a maximum point from which the creases originate. And we simplify this when we draw in this style to produce these points of origin. And because the lines originate from these points of origin, it allows us to control where the points originate from and what they look like in different positions. It also creates a really strong design. So if we focus on one arm and look at the elbow and the armpit, you can really see how this works. As the arm moves up, so does the point, and the lines follow it accordingly. So you can see with each adjustment, there is consistency between these frames. Now, if you outstretch the arm fully, the creasing is at a minimum, and in some cases you won't even see any creases at all. I've left one for the armpit. Let's see the animation, see how this looks. So this is the basic animation without creases. And now we add a few creases. And see how smoothly they move. They're not wobbling, they're definitely changing shape, but they're fairly consistent. Here I've added the points of origin, the little red squares, and so now you can see how I position the creases. These were the control mechanisms. So I've added a few more creases, especially on the elbow. And again, you can see how they're all moving consistently relative to one another. And just in case there's any doubt, here are the creases and the points of origin by themselves. And then the final scene, with as many creases as I felt I could load it up with. Any more, there's actually too many on the elbow, but this is to show you how you can control even a large number of creases using our points of origin and being extremely careful about how we originate the folds in the fabric. So remember, watch your points of origin, make sure they're in a good position, and make sure that all your lines originate from them correctly. And as long as you plot the lines, the same line in one keyframe is the same line in the one that follows, I think you'll have a much better time controlling believable fabric and clothing. Let's take a look at a couple of the most important principles used when animating clothing or fabric. Two of the most important are the use of strong shapes, such as S and C curves, as well as the use of reversal, or transitioning from one orientation to another. So as you can see here, moving from a right-facing C shape into a left-facing one, or vice versa, or from a right-facing S curve into a left-facing S curve. So if we move through these series of frames one by one, you can see how we transition from a C curve into an S curve, and from that S curve into a reverse C curve, and from that into another S curve to complete the cycle. When animated, we get a classic tail or a whip action. And notice how loose it is. This is exactly the feeling that you want to instill in clothing, as the vast majority of clothing is loose and flexible. The most basic example of this is with a simple graphical flag. If we start with a downward C shape, then transition into an S curve, and from that into an upward C curve, and from that into a different S curve, and then back into the original start frame, the original C curve, we should have the beginnings or the foundations of a fluid flag wave. When animated, you can see that something even this simple already begins to read as a flag. So something as basic as this would be fine for an animated icon in a simple computer game, for example. Now let's apply that principle to a more realistic flag. Although the shapes aren't quite so obvious, we still have a C shape on frame 1, an S curve on 5. On 9, I've gone much further than the simple graphical version and bunched up the flag so that it folds over on itself. On 13, there's another S curve, and 17 is a duplicate of 1, which completes the cycle. When animated, we get a pretty decent flag action. And notice that the crease lines move from left to right across the flag in a wave pattern, and they dissipate as they near the right. So let's overlay these drawings so you can get an idea about the range of motion. The next one is number 5, the next is on frame 9, and then 13, and then 17, of course, is the same as 1, so we complete the cycle. So from 1 to 5 to 9 to 13, back to 1. So there's a kind of a looped arc happening here. Now, I felt that this first flag pass was a little stiffer than I would have liked, and so I decided to loosen it up. A good way to do this is to add a big reversal or change to one of the keys. So I took frame 13 and I really snapped the flag into a stronger S curve, facing the opposite direction from my first version. And you can see the new position in red with the original beneath it in grey. So the result, as you can see here, is a much looser and a much more dynamic flap. That really feels like cloth to me now. A final touch added some overlap on the breakdown poses. So what I did was took some of these points at the end of the flap and just pushed them a little bit further on some of the breakdowns. This can be hard to follow, so let me slow this down a little bit. So you can see the overlap version in red where the points are overshooting. The bulk of the flag, as it begins to move left, is not obeyed by the tip of the flag, which continues to move right just a little bit. Now, how much success you have with this depends on your skill level and how comfortable you are with creating extra keyframes. However, if you're prepared to put in the time and effort and take some chances with your animation, this could be well worth your while. But in any event, the first version without the overlap looked great. When you add a little extra overlap, then it really becomes a very, very convincing flag animation. In this movie, we'll apply drag to a simple piece of clothing, in this case a cape. The torso I'm going to represent with a simple kidney bean shape, and we'll have a long cape hanging draped from the shoulders. The numbers below represent the keyframes. And just so you know, my keyframe numbers are on a 24 frame per second timing. If you're on 30, then you might want to adjust your numbers accordingly, and that goes for all my courses. So this image overlays the capes so that you can see the distance being traveled by the torso. As you can see, it's not a lot. I've color-coded the different layers or the different drawings, so it's slightly easier to interpret the different frames. But as you can see, if you look at the black, this line here, that's where the first kidney bean, the first chest frame begins. And 44, this orange one, is the end. So we're traveling a distance, little less than the distance of the chest area itself. It's not much. So here is the finished animation. And here it is with the arcs of the cape plotted and along with the velocity. And this is just a reminder to always plot your arcs to avoid square or straight or glitchy animation. And it's especially important with something that's soft and flowing like a hair or clothing. So now let's overlay these images and slide through them frame by frame so we can kind of wrap our heads around what's going on. So as the torso moves to the right, I added an opposing action on the bottom of the cape so that it's as if it catches the air, flares, and moves in the opposite direction of the torso just slightly. It's important that the cape react to the movement of the torso. The torso is the primary animation, the cape is the secondary. So when we go from here to here, we see that the torso is moving from left to right. And just for a little time, the cape moves from the opposite, from right to left. On the next frame, 28, we break the cape, reversing it from a C shape into an S shape. This will give it a feeling of flexibility. Otherwise, it would look like it was starchy and stiff. So notice how the lower end of the cape is still moving in the opposite direction of the torso. So this creates a really nice opposing action. On frame 36, in blue, the cape finally catches up, and now we're moving in the same direction as the torso. I broke the line at the bottom of the cape from one S shape into its opposite. So if you follow this curve here, it's one S shape, and this is the reversal of that. And this actually creates a really nice feeling of flexibility in the cape. So depending on the material property of the cape, it'll fall at a faster or a slower speed. Now, in this case, I wanted the cape to feel like it was made of a heavy material. Like imagine like a Roman soldier in Britain in the 3rd century. He's not going to be wearing silk. He's wearing something heavy. So this is made of a bulkier fabric. And so it's not going to be prone to being caught by the wind if it were made of silk or something really light. So on frame 44, the orangey yellowy coloured frame here, it's falling back into place pretty quick. And then we settle back into the final resting pose. And notice now that on 44, we've overshot the final position. Now this is much more realistic, as the cape wouldn't simply slide mechanically into frame 52. It's totally normal to overshoot a little and then slide back into the rest. So we go from 36 to 44, overshoot, and settle. An alternative way of treating this animation is to hold the body in place and then imagine that a gust of wind has caught the figure and it's billowed the cape as a result. So he's standing on a mountaintop or a fortress or something. And that's the final animation in this case. So bear in mind, it's exactly the same series of frames. All I've done is lock down the body. So for an exercise, you could create an extremely simple character, much like this, nothing fancy, suspend a cape, maybe of different lengths from the shoulders, and animate some variations on the scene. For example, what if he moves faster from left to right? Or what if he just turns in place? What happens then? So the sooner you become comfortable with the amount of area traveled by your clothing, by the capes, and the amount of overlap and the strength or weakness of the different S curves and C curves, the happier you'll be. But always remember, before you animate your clothing, your capes, anything like that, the primary animation, the character must be perfect. There's no point in animating a cape if you're going to change the timing of the body later on. When animating clothes, it's a good habit to have some idea of the material that the clothes are made of. And this is going to affect how you design it and how you animate it. Now, for most purposes, it's okay to have a rough idea. If it's a really thick material, like a heavy cashmere coat, or if it's something medium, like some polyester business suit, or it's really light like silk. So you have various families of materials. You'll know exactly, what I'm talking about. So in the figure on the left, the cape is clearly very light. And as a result, you can see it forming into lots of thin folds, whereas the one on the right is much thicker. Maybe it's heavy wool or something not so flexible. And so it has fewer folds. So if you look at the lower part of the illustration, you'll see that in any given gust of wind of equal strength, the lighter, more thin material is going to move further. It's more prone to being caught by the wind. It's going to move up faster to react, and much slower to settle. So it's also good to be constantly reminded how to draw these, because as the more realistic the style, the more lines and maybe the more intimidating it might be to draw these. So in the previous movie, I showed you how to construct these types of cape designs, but we'll take another look. So the first approach will be to draw the general form, as simple as you can. In this case, this blue outline is good. And at the base, I put in a curved wave line, and that's going to establish the bottom of the cape, and here in red. And I could have picked any number of different curves. This is just one that I happen to like. I could have broken these in any number of ways. And then we add the vertical lines, and they're going to give the cape solidity and volume. So let's take a look at a cape flutter. In the previous movie, we created a very similar action with a very basic design. And so in this example, we're going to animate the same action more or less, but with a much more detailed cape. So here's the scene fully animated. Now, no matter how realistic the final animation looks, it's crucial that the design is built over a fundamentally simple form, which you can see here in red outline, S curves and C curves. Notice the reversals of the lines from one C shape into an S curve back into a C, and this is what gives us the looseness. So now we can overlay the 6 frames so that you can get an idea of the range of relative motion between them. As you can see, the cape doesn't move particularly far. The key to this nice fluid feeling isn't moving it all over the place. It's the fact that none of the points stick. They're well spaced out. The ends of the cape are, nicely distant from one another. And we use reversal to keep the cape feeling loose. So now let's add like a really strong gust of wind to catch that cape and push it back. Now we can imagine that the figure is standing on the top of a mountaintop. See how the cape snaps into this flutter cycle. It happens on frame 19. Notice also that the sequence from 19 to 23 to 27 takes us back into the same pose. So 19 here and 27 here. this is the start and stop. They're identical. Once again, remind you one more time, S curves and C curves. Now, I may be cheating a little bit here with this line in the final one, but the fundamental basic structure here is an S curve. Here I've cycled the flutter 2 or 3 times, and it's a very simple cycle, but it definitely works. And remember, only 2 keyframes. It's not perfect, but it's very, very close. And for a lot of projects, this would work totally fine. And again, let's look at this in red outline, and you can see we've based an apparently complex animation over a very simple foundation. And one last thing to note, the reversals are applied to all 3 sides of the cape. There's no part of that cape that is locked into a C curve and stays there, or an S curve and stays there. Each of them is moving from C to S to C or back or to one or other variation of these basic forms. So remember this as you begin to expand beyond doing extremely simple capes to maybe more intimidating and more realistic ones. In the previous movie, we created a cape animation. Part of that animation was a flutter cycle where the cape is caught by a strong gust and flutters strongly. It was this band here from 19 through 23 to 27. And 27, of course, is the same as 19. That's our cycle, which we loop over and over again. Let's remind ourselves of what it looked like. Not too bad. It doesn't look like cardboard. So let's see if we can go a level beyond this. So the basic cycle was only 3 frames. 2 really, which, the third one being the same as the first. So really, there were only 2 unique drawings. And so 19, 23, and 27 in this example. So the secret is to add breakdowns and to do something different on these breakdowns other than a straight in-between. And you can see the breakdowns here in red and green. There's 21 and 25. Now, in this image, I've overlaid all 5 of the cape frames so that you can see how they are positioned relative to one another. We're going to take a closer look at these in a moment. So here's the finished animation. Now, you'll notice immediately how much looser and richer this cape flap is. It's starting to look really good. Once again, a reminder, it's based on fundamentally simple forms, which you see here in red outline, C shapes and S shapes. So now we're going to look at these drawings in sequence and see exactly what's going on. This is the first frame of the flutter cycle, frame 19. And now I will overlay the second frame, the breakdown, and this is in red, number 21. Then the second key in blue on frame 23. Now, if the breakdown had been done mechanically, the end points would be roughly in the same position, as you can see here between the black and the blue points. In other words, this point here and this point here are roughly where you would expect them on a normal in-between frame. But I've done something different here on this line of the cape, on the breakdown. I've punched it up into a place where a strict in-between shouldn't be. And this creates a reversal. This is an energy kick. It's as if the cape has been hit by a very fast gust of wind. It creates a wave action animation on that. So this was something that I did to see, I wonder what it looks like. And as a result, it created a very nice bolt of energy into the cape and gave it much greater flexibility. The second breakdown is in green, and this is the frame that closes the cycle between 23 and 27. Now remember, the 27 is identical to 19, so the first and the last frame in the cycle. Now here, a straight in-between should be roughly halfway between the blue and the black lines. But notice that the left point of the cape now shoots down, right here. You would expect an in-between to go there, and it doesn't. I punched it right down, as if it's been yanked down by the wind or some gust or some force of the fluttering. Notice also that the far edge of the cape is also shooting up past the blue and the black lines you see here. So you would expect a strict in-between to go between the black and the blue, and it doesn't. It does this extreme action. So what this is creating is a very strong circular rotary action basically around the entire area of the cape. So it's breaking us out of this simple up-down reversal. So let's overlay all 4. And now let's look again at the final animation. And here it is with the red outline. And here it is without. And now you can see the effect of all those little breakdown actions of where you feel it rather than see it. You just know, your mind just registers the fact that this is loose. It's not mechanical. And there's a very dynamic wave form that's now moving from one end of the cape to the other. So these are tricky. Once you begin applying these nice little breakdowns to the major capes or clothing between your keys, good things can happen, bad things can happen. You will find by practice, you'll become attuned to the kind of things that look good and the kind of things to avoid. So never miss a chance to experiment with this. Make your two cape positions and do something fun on the breakdown and see if it makes it better or not. When you animate a character with clothes or hair, the character is considered to be the primary animation, and the clothing or the hair is the secondary animation. And the motion of the hair or the clothing is going to be predetermined by that, by the primary, by the actor. So in this example, we see a piece of cloth tied to a little ball as it bounces along the ground. And the position of the cloth is entirely dependent on the physics of the ball. So essentially, wherever the ball is moving, the clothing tends to move or point towards the previous area. See how it's been dragged along that path. In any of these given images, the cloth is pointing back towards the area that it came from. And I've tried to keep this principle throughout the entire range of images. So it's a good general principle. It's not a law, but it's a very good rule of thumb. And here's the final animation. So it's got a nice kind of fluffy feel to it. You really get the sense that cloth is hitting air. Now we will look at a much more controlled action. It's a hand with a little flag, a pennant, and it's making a simple left-right waving gesture with it. So here's the completed animation. We're going to look at this now frame by frame. So here's the series of keyframes. And below them, you can see the relative frame or the appropriate frame numbers. Number 9 is a breakdown frame between 1 and 13. And as you can see, we see the drag here and here before we overshoot here and then settle back into our start position. So let's look at the frames in sequence. First, we have the start pose, frame 1. And next, the breakdown, number 9. And notice how the pointy end of the flag catches the air and it opposes the action of the flag. So as the leading edge of the flag moves right, the trailing edge moves left. Let me point that out. Between here, watch this point with the arrow, and then to there. So that's already creating a very nice smooth arc. Now, this doesn't have to happen. So for example, if the flag were to move really fast to the right, for example, if number 9 had the hand out here, this couldn't happen because we wouldn't want to drag the flag out that far. It might look too cartoony. So there are some circumstances in which the movement's too fast to allow you to do this. But wherever you can, you should watch out for areas where you can create these really nice little opposing actions because it looks really natural. So on frame 13, we have the rough midpoint of the swing, and it also gives us a chance to do a nice dimensional design of the flag. So we're not just dealing with a simple triangular shape. This is going to really make things more visually interesting. On frame 17, I also broke the curve into an S curve. So again, it loosens up the animation, makes the flag feel less like a very simple graphical symbol and much more like a real flag. And then on 23, we overshoot. And then we settle into the end pose on frame 31. So as you can see, I'll just go back. We're going from here to here. And we overshoot the end point and then settle back into there. So we have a nice little settle action. And here we have the frames overlaid, and I've color-coded them because these overlaid images can be pretty hard to read. But I think I've done a nice job color-coding them. So this will give you a rough feeling for the relative range of motion. So again, if you animate this yourself, you'll get roughly in the ballpark of the amount of distance that I traveled in this animation. So again, here's the final scene. And even with this very simple movement and just 5 keyframes, you can see how it's made a really nice little wave action. So if you're looking for ideas for, other things you might do, take the same starting position and wonder what would happen if I pulled it to the left instead of the right and waved in the other direction. So right now I'm going from start position to right and back to left. What if you were to reverse that? What would the flag look like? Can you create something that's appealing and simple with 5, maybe 6 keyframes? Clothing is a really big challenge when you animate because it can be hard to control all these folds and make them move smoothly. You also have the design challenge of how to draw nice shapes, as well as the task of making them move well. So there's a really important design principle to remember both when drawing and animating them, and that is that the hem of a dress or a garment is constructed usually out of some kind of O-shaped loop or a figure 8 loop, a basic form like this. Now, you can add more folds, which I've done in the middle image, as you can see right here. See this little loop? It's clearly more complex than a figure 8. I've just made a little variation around it, but the rest of the dress conforms to a figure 8 loop. And I've done something similar right there, and that's okay. It's also crucial that the clothing, the dress, whatever, conforms to the body beneath it. Now, in this case, I've drawn the anatomy before I drew the dress and then hung the dress from the anatomy. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a very light curve here, see the big egg-shaped body, and there's another one right here. Depending on how clear your monitor is, you should be able to see that. And the dress is suspended, hung from that anatomy. So let's start with a simple animation and a simple dress. So what I've done is built this around an imaginary sphere, like a basketball. And if you can see, I've kept that curved shape for the hips. And just imagine that we have an extremely simple piece of fabric hung over that ball. And you can see our O-shaped loop. And then we're moving into a series of figure 8s and other loops. So we start the drag action on 13 and we end on 37. And the sphere is traveling from left to right. Not this much, but definitely a few feet from left to right. So when fully animated, you can see the dress in its static form with the hem forming that simple loop right at the start. And then it reacts to the motion and the air resistance. And it flares up into this figure 8 and settles back into the O-shaped loop on the final frame. And in this version, I've put a red line around the base of the dress so that you can see that pattern, that O to the 8 back into the O. And let me slow it down just a little bit. Now we're going at about 25% speed. There we go. So here we have the frames overlaid in their exact relative positions so that you can compare them directly one to the other and see the amount of motion between each. And you'll notice from here to here, there's no overlapping action. Everything moves from left to right. One thing that I like to do often is to do a little opposing action. So if you were to drag that number 13, the red image, a little further, you might pull it out to here. In this case, I was more conservative. I gave the dress a little more weight, more mass. So the whole thing moves from left to right. And we only see a real overshoot action then, or an opposing action rather, on the final overshoot before we go into the settle. But all of the other images, that's like a loop, another loop. And here we have a very shallow figure 8. And here on the overshoot, another figure 8. So in this example, it looks similar. It's the same basic simple shape. And in this case, I'm keeping the hips standing in place, but I'm going to give them a turn. So we're going to have the hips pivot in place a little to the left and then to the right and then back to the center. And this is going to set the dress in motion and create these really nice, really beautiful looking curve patterns. And this will give you a better idea about the action. So these are the keyframes from the finished version with the legs attached. So now you can see the ball beneath the dress, and that'll help you to see the orientation and the pivoting of the body and the center line. So if you look at this dotted line down the middle here, that's our center line. And you see on frame 15, she pivots to her left and then pivots back to her right and then goes and settles back, pivoting in this direction. So it's quite a turn. It's got 2 or 3 different sections of motion in it. So we would expect the dress to create a reasonably complex reaction to that. So here's the final animation. Now, I'll be perfectly honest, I would ideally like to go back in and, fine tune this. But this is a really decent first pass, and we are starting to get a really nice kind of flaring natural feel to the bottom of the dress. It's certainly not sticking too badly anywhere. The biggest problem you'll face when doing this is that you'll get sticks, areas where a fold seems to jam or it moves the wrong direction. But what I'm feeling here for our first version is a really nice dynamic, swirl. So probably what this needs for my final satisfaction would be just for it to have the motion pushed a little further. I think I've been a little too conservative with it. But nevertheless, we are getting the nice swirl feel to it. So now I'm going to move through these series of frames slowly so you can see the relative motion. So on 15, I'm going to go from here to 15. The hem becomes a figure eight as the dress catches the air. And this is our anticipation to the turn. So she's moving left before she's about to turn right, her right. And then we twist in the other direction on 21. And now notice how the crease lines reverse from here to here. And we reach the leftmost pose on 26. And notice how I've kept the crease lines and the folds pretty similar between these two, as I wanted the movement of the dress to be pretty smooth. And as we turn on 31, the right side of the dress breaks and reverses as it hits the wall of air. The left side holds the same shape but begins to billow a bit. Now on 36, the left side feels gravity at last and it begins to fall, and the curve on the right side breaks very quickly, and this will be its highest point. Frame 40 is the overshoot, and then 44 is the settle back into our static pose. And again, this is our range of motion. So this is the thing to take away from this if you try to duplicate this or improve upon it. This is the range of motion that I move. If you follow the hips from here to here, it's not quite the actual size of the width of the hips themselves. It's about 70%. So if we look again at the frame spread out, you'll see I've used certain basic principles. The dress form is fundamentally simple. It's hanging to an O shape or a figure eight. If the folds appear, they're variations of a figure eight. They're quick and temporary secondary folds, which you can see here or there, smaller ones here. I've used reversals where necessary between 15 and 21 or between 26 and 31. For example, this line here reverses into this line there. So if you look throughout, you'll see where I've performed reversals, and that creates flexibility in the fabric. Quite subtle though. So the important thing that you want to avoid is folds or lines sticking, and it's the biggest problem you'll face when you create your own animations. So as a rule of thumb, it's safer to move things too much than too little, but you're going to have to find your own comfort zone and what works with your design. So again, here's the final animation. So my advice is that you create some simple animations of your own to start out with. Maybe try to do a version of this, but maybe push it a little bit further. I think I was a little too conservative with some of my designs. I think I could have gone way further with them. You might do a longer dress, a shorter one, all kinds of different design shapes. And just start out simple and then work your way up to more complex motions and just see how you become comfortable with the strange world of these wave ripples that move around these O shapes and these figure eight loops. One of the great dangers that an animator can face is losing sight of what the purpose of animation is. And it's as simple as this. You have to create the illusion that the animation is alive, that the character you're looking at has a mind. So you want the audience to believe that the images on the screen have souls. A great exercise that you'll need to work towards this is the classic flower sack. Now here I've made a short series of images of a sack of flour in different attitudes. So let's take a look at each one. This is our first image, our starting position, and just a reference in place like an actual inanimate bag of flour. So I'm going to consider this our neutral pose, our zero pose, and everything will work out of that and try to match it as well as we can. So without showing you which pose this is, I think you can probably come up with a fairly good guess as to what it is. So essentially, we're looking at an action pose. He's heroic, confident. He's certainly not afraid. He's ready to go marching off to fight somebody. And here's our next pose, rolling on its back. And this would be a good pose, for example, for a laughter. It's a belly laugh. He's like seen something hysterical. So in this pose, we have a contact position, which could be like a really good, confident walk. He's striding out to camera. And so the next one, we have our sack jumping up into the air. So he could be running towards the camera, but I imagine this as, he's won the lottery. Here he's a little bit slouched over, and maybe he's found out that the lottery ticket numbers were wrong, so he's feeling a little bit moody. Now, don't be afraid if you do this exercise to twist the flour sack. It's not made of concrete, and this will allow you to make him do other actions like waving goodbye. And so in this example, I like this one a lot. It's like a much stronger version of the previous moody pose where he's got some terrible news. He's completely dejected. So, let's lay it on a bit thick here. And this is a nice example. So, you can do like a really strong attitude pose. So this could be a sneak. We could imagine him like sneaking, dum, 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 like this. Or it could be an anticipation to a run off screen. So we could put him into this pose as an anticipation. And then, boom, off. Here's another sneaky motion. So in this case, it's a bit of a tiptoe. So if you're wondering what principles, it's all well and good to show somebody all these drawings, but the more important thing is to figure out what principles did I apply to create these. And they're pretty simple, as it turns out. The most crucial is silhouette and negative shape. The silhouette is the positive, the black area, and that's the shape of the character. And the negative shape is the white space around them. These have to be strong. The pose has to read in silhouette form for this exercise to be good. And almost as important, or just as important, is a good line of action. Now, notice how it's an imaginary line. It goes from the base of the character to the head, most times. And notice how each pose is based around a C curve or an S curve. You'll very rarely see me use an M curve or a W curve. They just don't tend to be strong enough. So if you simplify it to a C or an S, you'll be on good, solid ground. And this gives the flour sack a good sense of structure. It almost works as a spine, a sense of anatomy. And it also gives you the backbone around which you can then, build your emotions and actions when you begin to draw. And you should notice also that the dejected poses use a downward curving C. So let's see here, the moody one here, it's like hanging down. And if you really want to push it, like really hang it down. And the confident ones are the opposite. The C's seem to be stretching up confidently. So my advice is get a sketch pad and just very quickly doodle some flour sacks. So you might find it a good idea to pick an emotional state, just one, like fear or anger or joy, and just work through 20 or 30 flour sack variations. Also, good advice is to draw fast. I wouldn't spend maybe more than 30 seconds or a minute on each drawing. Don't erase them. If you do one you don't like, just move on and do another. Stay fluid, stay fast. And then when you're done, sift through the doodles and see which ones are best. So as a really good loosening up exercise, this will be a very important thing to do, just to focus your mind on performance and acting. The principle of good silhouettes in its essential form, it's pretty simple to understand. You take a scene that you've already animated, and this is a scene I used in a previous course if it looks familiar. And in the old days, people who were really devout about this would trace off all their drawings and colour the entire character black so that there's no internal detail, only the outline. And if you can still read the action and understand what the figure is doing and what they're feeling, then you know you've succeeded. You've communicated the essence. And in this case, we know exactly what's going on. This is an angry man. And to show the same animation in a more extreme setting, we're further back. And even from this distance, you can still see precisely what's going on. The whole performance reads as pure pantomime. So in the case of each of these poses, you don't need to see the inner lines to understand the action or the emotion. Now, of course, if you do have a healthy silhouette, the inner detail is a plus, but it's not essential. So after showing you that, the basic concept, how do you go about creating a strong silhouette on a figure? And the basic rules of thumb are, you always build your character around a line of action. And that's the red line in this image. And this is the imaginary line that runs usually from the base of the feet to the top of the skull or the top of the hat or whatever the character's costume is. You don't have to follow this precisely when you actually flesh in the character, but as long as most of the figure conforms to this curve, you'll get a pretty good chance of having a good dynamic design. And of course, strong exterior negative shapes as well as strong interior positive shapes are vital. So the areas marked in the little red crosses, they're all interesting, strong design shapes by themselves. Like this area here, that's a nice shape. Closed internal spaces should be avoided, but this isn't always possible. So when you have to close a space, like in the crux of the elbows here, you have to make it a clean shape. And as a general guide, usually larger is better. So if you must have small spaces, like in these bent elbows, try to avoid making the spaces much smaller than this. If you go smaller than this, they look like little pixels. They can be eye-catching. They're ugly. So, for example, notice this tiny negative area enclosed by the arm, right in there. It's just barely a dot. And I hate this. It's the kind of shape that you'll get on an in-between, and that's all right. But on the keyframe, I don't think it's a good idea to make something this tiny. So there are two possible approaches that will make this a better design. So option one, eliminate the shape completely. And just nudge the arm behind the character to remove the shape. So now you have a completely continuous elbow or an arm behind the body. Option two is just move it out slightly. Push the arm forward. And this is a much stronger internal negative shape. So which of these approaches you can choose could depend on the individual case and your preference and what's going to work best to convey the attitude of the character. And I think this solution is a bit stronger than closing it behind, but just avoid these. Here's a really good example of an outer negative shape, as in the area between the legs. Here, that's a good strong open shape, easy to read. We have two internal closed shapes of different sizes, but again, both good, strong, open. So if you're going for a really cartoony style, this is the kind of thing you should be working towards. So if you're still not having luck with the silhouette, it might be because your pose is weak or timid. So try pushing the pose, plussing it, making it more cartoony. And in the case of the left figure, he's a little on the, it's okay, it's a good strong pose, but this is stronger. And I put the weight more onto one hip, twisted the backbone a bit, and we start getting these nice, stronger negative shapes as a result. So try to remember those rules of thumb, and the better your negative shapes, the better your animation will read. Let's continue our look at silhouettes, because this subject really is important. Without silhouettes, which are a deceptively simple idea, it's going to be really hard for you to create the strongest animation that you can create. So if you just look at the black figures, don't look at the drawings, but look at the black silhouettes, and look at the second row and move your eye across any of these figures, like this guy here. He's scratching his head, puzzled, not happy. This guy's rolling on his back laughing. Here's a good, confident walk. This guy's on the stage, taking the applause of the crowd. This guy's angry, looking at something down here that he doesn't like. Another person here deep in thought. Another person deep in thought. This guy is the most obscure, but at least in terms of the physical action, I'm in no confusion. He's definitely energetic. He's about to stamp on the ground around here. And he's kind of like doing some Tarzan chest beat. So another guy on this side, furious. He's lost a ping pong match. This is a kind of a carefree kind of walk. Another really angry person, and this guy is frustrated having, lost his $20 bill for lunch. So in each of these instances, I don't need to see the line work. I don't need to see their faces. I don't need to see what way their heads are tilting. So this is a fundamental principle that you need to master. I know often you won't be able to get the perfect silhouette and you'll have to compromise. But the most important thing is that regardless of your silhouette, its relative strength or weakness, the important thing is not so much it's a strong design, but do I read the emotion? Can I look at the silhouette and have a fairly good idea as to whether or not the figure is happy or sad or frightened or angry or whatever? And on the right side here, we have a weaker silhouette from a design point of view. But I know this guy is shuddering. He's clearly in a bad place. That's a silhouette that's doing its job. So it could be a stronger design, but nevertheless, it works. And I can settle for that. But of course, I want stronger silhouettes than this, as a general rule. So most of these poses are fairly open. Now, the third from the right is the most closed off. This guy here who's all hunched up. And sometimes you have to do these poses. This is yet another example of a pose that isn't the strongest design pose, but I can look at that even in outline, and I understand precisely that this guy is not happy. He's bothered about something, he's physically closed up, and it works. And it's got a nice basic S-curve, and it hunched over here. And, it's got kind of a cluttery little look around this area. But nevertheless, in spite of that, it works. It's not as strong as some of the others here, but it's a functional silhouette. It's doing its job. This is a silhouette of a walk cycle that I animated for a previous course on attitude walks. And I actually really strongly recommend you look at that course if you're ever curious about how to do walk cycles that communicate emotional states. And here you can see we add the lines at the end as a little tail, but you didn't need them. You knew even before I added those that this walk was a sneak. So what I'm going to do is focus on the contact pose, which is just about here. It's one of these roughly. And the contact pose in an attitude walk, that's the pose that establishes the overall emotional state of the walk. And you tend to cluster most of your drawings around the contact pose in an attitude walk. I can't go into it in any more detail here. Like I said, if you want to go further with that, then the previous course on attitude walk cycles is an excellent one for you to look at. You'll find that as your comfort with pushing poses grows, that your silhouettes will improve also. There's a kind of a positive feedback effect. The stronger your pose, the stronger your silhouettes. And the stronger your silhouettes, the stronger the negative shape. The stronger the negative shape, the more the poses read. So hopefully you can generate this feedback effect in which your desire to create these strong silhouettes forces you to make better poses, which make better silhouettes. So here you can see all the principles in action. On the left, the fully animated colored scene. On the right, we have the line of action, the negative shapes, etc. And at all points of this action, you're in no doubt. We're looking at a man with a pickaxe hitting the ground. Here's another example of an effective silhouette and another bashing action. And because the keys are so strong, that clarity gets passed on to all the in-betweens, so the entire action is clear. So it's very important to have good, strong key poses. The stronger that key silhouette, the in-betweens won't be as strong, but they're still clear. So your strongest silhouettes would be on the keys, there and there. And the in-betweens, understandably, cannot be as strong as the keys. A weak key will create really weak in-betweens. So this is something to really watch out for. So I'm going to round this off with a really cartoony spin action. And again, this is from a previous course on hand drawing in Flash, if you're interested in learning that. So it's a spin, very elaborate. And I was wondering, how would this read when I converted it to silhouette? So if we play this scene at slow speed, let's just take it down by maybe a notch, and maybe one more. Even something as elaborate as a full body rotation can still be read in pure outline mode. So the important thing is, again, like I said before, that the keys are strong, and that way you can drop a little clarity on the in-betweens. So weak keys are a fatal mistake in the world of silhouettes. So happily in this scene, I was careful to keep the action clear throughout, so that even with the occasional in-between that might seem a little cluttered, like maybe some of these look a little less clear than the keys, we still know precisely what's happening. Let me take us back to full speed. So this is something that I think you'll find very liberating once you become more comfortable with the art of just thinking about your figure in outline. So let's take a look at objects, how you make physical objects that aren't alive seem to be alive. It's something that we've done in animation since the very earliest days. So this movie will focus more on design, strictly, than on animation, but I will show you some basic principles about how to, move these things. So one of the main approaches would be to find some part of the physical object that can be anthropomorphized. So how to make it look like a part of a human body. The classic example of this is a broom, where we split the brush strands into two legs. If you wanted to, you could bolt on arms for more human behavior, and that's what was done in Fantasia, for example, when they used a similar character to the broom here. So if you want to try to copy this walk, you'll see my timing charts down at the bottom. And just a reminder, my timing is on 24 frames a second, the traditional animation timing. So if you are following along, try to match that. And if you're on 30, add a few frames here and there to slow it down. Maybe a couple of frames between each of these would be enough. So here's that final scene, fully animated. And I put a nice little tilt on the top of the broom. You might notice the thing zips out and we get a nice little kidney bean loop up there. And the human brain's an amazing thing. It can look at anything and map a human characteristic onto it, and it does it right here with the legs. And of course, the more pleasing your design. So if we create like a nice pose like that, it's like Cossack pants. So this would be great for anything with some Russian background music. It would look really good. So let's move on. I'm not going to focus any much more on the actual animation here. We'll just look at the actual design principles involved. So let's take a teapot and see how we would approach turning this teapot into a character. So in this case, the natural thing to do would be to make the spout the mouth and to make the gap between the lid and the pot to create like a little negative space that the human mind will read that as eyes or eyebrows. So notice also that as I create variations on the spout for different mouth shapes, I'm trying to keep them as close as possible to the original shape. There's like a V shape and a V shape. It's like two little, like a vertical pointing V and a vertical pointing V down. So where possible, we've kind of cheated here a little bit, but where possible, you see each of the variant shapes keeps that essential principle. And that's to keep founded upon the original design. It doesn't mean you have to do it for every shape, but the more you can do that, the more believable it's going to be that you're looking at a talking teapot. The same principle can apply to a door handle. The classic example of this would be Disney's Alice in Wonderland. And in that movie, and in this example, the original keyhole shape is retained throughout the animation, so that the ooh mouth and the wide open mouth still look like functional keyholes. And, we're kind of pushing it a lot here, but even so, we still have a shape. That shape will transition into this. We can blend this shape into this shape, but certainly the ooh shape and the wide open shape are still recognizable as originating from the inanimate keyhole. You can turn a house into a face if the design of the house is sufficiently symmetrical. So, if you have one window on each side, there's going to be a natural tendency for the brain to read the door as a mouth and the eyes, the windows as eyes. And there's a classic example of this in the horror movie, the Amityville Horror, in which the upper windows of the house appear as glowing eyes. It's quite scary. So also notice that many of the modern Mac mansions are so poorly designed, they're very asymmetrical, and they would not allow for this method. So this was actually as a result of classic craftsman design that where symmetry was a really important principle. So we've probably all seen movies where cars, trains and planes have been used as cartoon characters. And Pixar's Cars, of course, is the best known. But there were also, before them, a series of car adverts that also used very similar anthropomorphized automobiles. Thomas the Tank Engine's another well-known series that uses train engines with faces just bolted onto the front. So there are, I think, two basic approaches with anthropomorphizing machines like this. You can use as much of the existing form as a surrogate for human features, or you can bolt them on, or you need them. So on the left, you'll see the first approach, the more subtle approach, where I found the design features of the car that most closely approximate human eyes and a human mouth. On the right side is the more, brute force is a harsh way of putting it, but where you just say, I just want to put a mouth on it and I want to put eyes on it. And you don't worry about the physical necessity of a human driver or the mechanical coherence or logical coherence of the vehicle. And you just have these enormous eyeballs, which is, I guess, the movie Cars does this. And I presume there's a big brain hiding inside the cabin. So I don't know how far you can take this, but nothing's stopping you from making a toilet talk, putting eyes, bolting eyes on the cistern, and you have a talking toilet. So there's another approach, which is to use little or no anthropomorphic features on the character. So on the left, we have done that. We've put, we're using the little legs of the beams here as, they look like arms holding up a hat. On the right side, we have a desk lamp. And there's no attempt to make this desk lamp seem like it's in any way got limbs. So the classic example of this, I'll cite Pixar again because they're kind of the people who really defined this, and their iconic lamp, which appears at the start of all of their movies. So what I've done is create my own version of that to show you how you can take an object with absolutely no features whatsoever that are recognizably human, and then simply through motion to make it look like it has personality. The one thing your brain is doing when you look at this, it's interpreting the lamp, the head of the lamp, as the head of an animal or a human. But other than that, there are no legs. There's nothing that I can map onto this as a foot. I mean, there's the base, obviously, but I don't really interpret that as a foot. And all of the personality is coming from the motion. So that's another approach as well, where I guess it's a purer approach to anthropomorphizing a dead object. So you can also use plants as living characters, and a great example of this is a tree, of course. And we've all seen Lord of the Rings, where we have trees walking around, smashing things up. So being a natural object, it's fairly easy to design knots and creases that will be read by the brain as an eye, or eyes or mouths, and limbs that can be read as arms. And as you can see, I've just made some, knots in the trunk, and it's a lot of fun actually to draw these. So my advice to you as an exercise, look at a few objects, maybe things that I haven't covered in this course. Look around your house and see how you would approach any given object as an animated character. Would you do it in the pure form and just do it through motion? Or is there any way that you could incorporate a part of that object as a body part, a head, a limb, an arm, a leg, laptops, phones, shoes, that kind of thing? So that would be a nice exercise for you just for a while to see what could be done with those. So now we'll look at how to move inanimate objects. In the previous movie, we saw how to design different approaches and different philosophies of animating things. So the most basic approach is to simply take the object and animate it without worrying about whether or not it has arms, legs, or a head. And in this case, a simple coffee mug. Now, notice how I've bolted on a face in the final two poses, which is another way of how to anthropomorphize an object, put a face on it. So very simple animations, but pretty effective, can be done like this. You can squash and stretch and gather, and then we settle into the final pose. So in this sequence, just squash and stretch is enough to make the mug hop from one position into another. And we use line of action to give the mug a little emotional attitude. So, a strict mug would be like a vertical line. In this case, we have a slight C curve, and even something as simple as that. These little C curves here and here and here are getting us into the realm of the cartoony and of the more dynamic and alive. All well and good, but what if you want to do something a little more realistic in the sense of a walk? So I just sketched these out to think, how would I handle this? And one great way is to forget that the mug is ceramic. And, we go beyond squash and stretch, or we go further with it and then begin to twist and torque the cylinder into S-curves. So if you take frame 9, for example, you'll see we have an S-curve, and if we follow that around, now there's like a figure 8 loop. So we go from a circular, strict O-shaped loop, and now we have a figure 8, and that's creating the illusion of a foot. And without even drawing a foot, we plant them back into an O, and then we do a reverse figure 8, S-curve here, which is we follow it through, we have our little figure 8 loop. And let's see what this looks like when animated. So even with this very quick, very basic timing, and I haven't done anything fancy here at all, we get what looks to anybody like a walk cycle. Could be a toilet roll, any cylindrical inanimate object, could be, a bucket. This is a pretty cool tool to have if you're ever given the task of take that bucket, take that tube, that metal pipe, make it walk. It can be done. So I'll just go through the sequence, the final sequence frame by frame. There's our figure 8 loop, planted into an O on the ground, back to another figure 8 loop, and squish onto the ground. And it's as simple as that. So what if we have a more complex geometry, like a chair? Here we have a problem that we really can't treat in the same way at all. We have to make these legs walk. The brain's going to look at those legs and say, those are legs. We could apply an animal walk, like a dog walk, to the animation of the legs. Nothing wrong with that. But I think it's a fantastic opportunity to just invent something original and not worry about realism or mapping an animal walk onto it. After all, it's a walking chair, so who can tell how it's supposed to walk? So as long as the motion that you design, that you invent, is believable and looks good, we should be happy with it. So in this case, I've decided that the easiest way will be to move the front 2 legs forward and then hold the back 2 legs planted. So when the front 2 legs have made their step, then the rear 2 catch up. So it's a front 2 step and then a back 2 step. It's pretty simple. So let's just go through the roughs, the first. Then we anticipate back with the left front leg leading. Gets planted, and at the same time, or just shortly after that, the right front leg lifts. And notice too that I'm treating the seat as flexible. So I'm not worried about this thing looking like it's a flat piece of wood. This is a cartoon. So let's use the things that we can do in the cartoon world, and the brain will accept it. We plant that leg down, and then we follow with the back leg, plant that. And I think I do a little cheat with this leg. There's in the final animation, you'll see there's like a little hop because it's kind of hidden back there. So here's the final chair walk cycle. And I don't think you'll probably see an animal walk like this, but it does look like a walk. My brain has looked at this for a while, and it has no problem reading that as a walk. And notice as well, as I mentioned, here's our little final, which you don't see in my original drawings, but the back rear leg, also a little move back there, see there? You should take the task of animating an object as an opportunity to experiment and to invent. It's not meant to be something where you need to go looking at maybe there is existing material that can inspire you, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be afraid to make your own. I don't feel under any obligation to copy my walk. This is a good start, but maybe you can come up with a better one, and I always stress that. So see these as good chances to have a lot of fun, because I think it's great fun to take a thing and to make it look like it's an animal or a person. In this movie, we'll take a look at hair and how to apply secondary action or drag to some basic hair design. Notice that the hair in this example is, I said, made of very simple forms. So it's a good idea to think of hair as groupings of larger shapes. So in this case, we have hair made out of strands, but I've broken it down into 3 basic areas. The yellow for the triangular kind of wedge at the front, and the 2 big blocks, the green and blue at the right and the left. And now this doesn't mean that we have to draw them as these crude shapes, but it's a good idea when you're beginning to conceive of the character's hair as some variation of this principle. Also, again, note the numbers between these drawings. These are our keyframe numbers for timing the animation. And once again, these are 24 frames per second numbers. So if you animate on 30, you might want to add a couple of frames between them to get a closer match. So here's the final animation with all the in-betweens added. Now, the drag only happens on the front part of the hair. I didn't really bother doing anything fancy with the stuff on the side because I reckoned it just wasn't long enough to really do anything too interesting with a motion of this speed. So you can see that the little front area pulls slightly at the start, then overshoots and settles. So it's a very simple action, but just enough to keep it from looking like it's starch. So we'll take a look at this now, frame by frame, and you can see just how little drag I used, because the animation looked like a lot, but it's really tiny. So here's the start frame, and I'm going to overlay frame 5, the breakdown frame in red. That's where the drag begins. And you'll see already how difficult it is to see how much is being applied. It's very subtle. So if I go from here to here, maybe the hair should have been here if it was going to be truly stiff. So it didn't take a lot to create that initial drag effect. Frame 9 in blue, it's more of a simple in-between frame. There's nothing magical happening here. Into frame 12, this is our overshoot in green. And then finally we settle back into the end pose. So frame 12 goes slightly beyond and then back into 15, the black drawing. So we have our settle slow in from here to there. Very minor. So now let's cycle through the frames without overlaying them. Might be a bit easier to see. Drag, and then catches up, overshoots, and settles. And again, the final animation. So as you can see, a little goes a long way. So here's a female head with longer hair. And in this case, I simplified the animation even further, using just 4 keyframes. Because if you remember, the blue frame, the fifth, the one in the center on the previous animation, really wasn't doing very much. So I wanted to see if we could simplify it one more step. Now, in this example, she has long hair. The man had really short hair. She has shoulder length hair. So all three groups, the front, the left, the right, will drag. So this is the final animation that results from those 4 drawings. So let's look at these drawings in overlay mode so that you can see just how little or how much movement was needed for this nice effect. So on frame 5, that's the second key where the drag begins for the first time. Notice how the edge of the hair on the trailing side, on the side here, it drags so much that it moves very slightly in the opposite direction of the head turn. And so does the point of the hair on the leading side. That's right here. So if I go from this to this, you'll see that we have the head moving from left to right, but we have the hair down here opposing that action and going from right to left. You can do this in some instances where you have these more subtle constrained emotions. If she was moving from here to there, you probably wouldn't be able to get away with this. But this opposing action creates a very nice effect. Notice also I didn't apply it to the point on the top. I could have. I decided not to because it's nice to have some variation. So not everything opposes, not everything is mechanical and moves in the same way. I reckon too that the hair on top might be a bit stiffer than the points down here. On frame 9 we have the overshoot, and this is all the hair catching up and going past its final position, and then it settles. So we go from the 5, the drag, the blue in 9 is the overshoot, and then we settle back into 15. So the frames without being overlaid, the drag, overshoot, settle. 4 frames. So there's a final touch if you want to add just a little more complexity. And this may depend on whether you're working in a digital system like Flash or Harmony or an easy-to-use CGI rig where these kind of changes can be done very quickly. If you delay the drag of the hair by 1 or 2 frames, it creates a really subtle delay. This makes the animation more realistic. So you can, for example, offset these various timings. So you can have the drag on the left side happen 1 frame before or after the drag on the right side. So it's an extremely subtle alteration. It can really be difficult to do if you're drawing on paper. And this was the hardest part for those of us who trained in the old days when we were working on paper, because you would end up with key actions on in-between frames. And it could be quite a chore. So like I said, depending on whether or not you're drawing each frame laboriously by hand, which I've done, and I know how much work it is, or if you have an easier way of offsetting the timing in a digital animation program, you may want to experiment with this. And even if you're drawing, you may want to experiment with it just to see the difference it makes. And it can be hard to visualize this. So what I've done is I've overlaid the 2 versions, the one without this timing offset and the one with it. So you can see how subtle the change is. Let me slow it down really slowly. And you can see that I have delayed the hair on one side very slightly by a frame or 2. And you get a much more natural overlapping animation as we move into the final resting place. So it's definitely an advanced technique, but it's one that will pay off dividends if you can master it. So don't be afraid to try it and see how it works out for you.